Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us for the second half of our show is civil liberties attorney Harvey Silverglate, co-founder of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and the author of 3 Felonies a Day, How the Feds Target the Innocent. Harvey, welcome back to the show.
It's good to be back. It's been a while.
It has been, maybe a couple of years. I asked you back because an issue you're very passionate about has moved onto the front burner during this election cycle, and I thought you might help us put it into perspective. That issue is the combined impact of overcriminalization and the use of selective prosecution to advance political policy, particularly in cases where the legislature has chosen not to act. Let's start with a quick review of overcriminalization. How do you define it?
There are several aspects of overcriminalization. The first obvious aspect is too many things are considered to be criminal in the society. Too many things are subject to the criminal law. And what happens then is that everybody ends up committing multiple crimes in the course of a day.
Unknowingly, simply because so many things are outlawed. And the government then gains tremendous power over the individual because since all of us are criminals, the government can't put all of us in prison. So it selects, and that selection can be a very nefarious process that gives the government additional power because it has the power to ruin your life or not ruin your life. Plus, in the world of big data, our whole lives are laid out behind us, easy enough for any prosecutor to pick through and find things they don't like.
Oh, very easy. But you see, that's only one problem, the proliferation of criminal statutes and regulations. Remember, Congress in particular has adopted this terrible procedure. It adopts broad criminal laws and then gives the bureaucrats in the administration the authority to enact regulations under those broad laws. And the violation of a regulation becomes a felony.
I wanted to ask you about that because usually if something's going to be a felony, if they're going to put you in jail, not just fine you or tax you, a legislator has to vote on it. Now, what you're saying is we've got unelected bureaucrats that make up rules that are maybe never even seen by legislatures that a prosecutor can then put you in jail for, like, say, building a pond on your own farm property.
Correct. You know, Britain has just voted to leave the European Union, and a lot of commentary says that one of the problems that the British electorate had with the European Union was not the idea of economic cooperation, because there are a lot of advantages to being in the European Union. You don't need special visas to go across borders, and it made business easier. However, there was one huge problem, and that was the bureaucrats were starting to run the countries that were members of the Union. I'm talking about the central bureaucrats.
In Brussels.
In Brussels. And in a way, it was like a foreign occupying army, but it wasn't an army with guns. It was an army with pens, and extremely dangerous. And the Brits had enough of it. Well, you know, you want to know the truth? We in this country, the United States, we're run by bureaucrats more and more. And it's a very dangerous trend.
You mentioned before, prosecutorial discretion is an integral component of our justice system. I mean, it pretty much has to be if your observation is true that everybody commits 3 felonies a day. Elected district attorneys and appointed federal prosecutors are human, and they have party affiliations and in many cases political ambitions. How do they avoid the moral hazard of using their office to punish or intimidate political opponents?
They don't. That is one of the problems. They do not avoid the moral hazard. They relish the moral hazard. And this is especially true of federal prosecutors who have enormous power over state and local politicians. Here in Massachusetts, the U.S. Attorney's Office is running a veritable reign of terror over state political officials. And right now, the mayor of Boston, his administration is being completely wrecked by a single woman, the United States Attorney, who has released her stormtroopers on that administration, claiming that there are violations of all kinds of extortion statutes and deprivation of honest services statutes.
And they don't even understand what it is they're alleged to have done. And the reason is they really haven't done anything unusual, they haven't done anything wrong, they haven't done anything illegal. But the U.S. Attorney is managing to shoehorn quite ordinary political activity into the rubric of federal fraud.
So how do you distinguish between Tammany Hall and smelly politics as usual? Where is the line? Who draws it?
Well, certainly it should not be federal bureaucrats like the United States Attorney. That's a matter for the local government and state government to figure out.
Okay.
And in fact, different states have different ways of approaching it. You know, there was recently a federal conviction of a former governor, Bob McDonnell of Virginia. He was convicted. He was given a multi-year sentence. It was affirmed by the Court of Appeals. I was one of the few people who was writing about that, saying...
And what was alleged?
It was alleged that he had dealings with a businessman who lavished gifts on him and his wife. And what that businessman wanted was an introduction to the people in the state who might do various testing of a product that he had developed.
But don't the lobbyists call that access?
Well, of course, that's what it is. And the fact is, McDonnell did introduce him to the people in the state who would do the testing. And guess what? They decided not to do it. They didn't do the testing. He didn't get what he was hoping
so
to
he wasted
get.
his money.
But of course, there hadn't been any what we lawyers call quid pro quo. It was not a deal where the governor assured him he would get what it. He used his money to get meetings with the governor and meetings with various people.
And then you're on your own.
Then you're on your own. And his product didn't meet the standards that the administration had established.
And that's pretty much politics as usual in this country, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And, you know, does it sound a little tawdry? Well, would you like to suggest to me an alternative system short of a dictatorship? You tell me. I think that that's reasonable until we figure out a better way to conduct politics.
Well, you've also accused prosecutors not only of creating a separate set of laws to use against people they don't like, but they give their friends a break on it.
Yes. And, of course, that's the kind of discretion that the feds have. When you have boundless statutes, boundless meaning you can give them any interpretation you want, you can use them against anybody you want, your big power then is the power to wreck or not to wreck lives, and naturally you wreck the lives of people you don't care about rather than your friends.
And it doesn't necessarily take a conviction to do that.
It sure doesn't, because a single indictment, even if you win it, it can bankrupt you, it can wreck your reputation, and it can occupy 3-4 years of your life.
So how long has Hank Greenberg been under the microscope for that in New York?
Well, forever. And Greenberg is among the unusual people who resisted them. You know, typically, this doesn't say much for a lot of our citizens, typically a person who's innocent makes a deal rather than fights it, because to fight it is years and years, and it's a bankrupting experience. And it could end up in a conviction. So they make a deal, and they agree to testify against somebody else. This is what the feds call climbing the ladder up toward the real target that they're looking for.
Wasn't that designed to go after the mafia?
It was originally designed to go after the mafia. They would turn the lower echelon soldiers in the mob against their lieutenants and then against the higher-ups. And that got transmogrified, so to speak, into all kinds of businesses and every other political defendants. So the government then threatens to indict you or does indict you and then makes a deal. If you tell a certain story, they'll go easy on you or they'll even let you go. And how do you decide what story to tell? Well, you listen to what it is that the prosecutor, quote,
and mimic it.
Thinks you know, right? Hopes you will testify to, and then you repeat the story. As I think my friend Alan Dershowitz used to put it in his law school classes, they teach the witness not only how to sing, but also how to compose. And that act of composition, which itself should be a crime, it's essentially suggesting a witness perjure himself under oath, that becomes the way out rather than a crime.
How many of these federal prosecutions actually end up in front of a jury trial?
About 3 to 4%.
And the reason for that is that it's extremely dangerous to go to trial because the laws are so vague, it's almost impossible to defend against these allegations, number one. Number two, the government can produce as many lying witnesses as they need to because of what I just told you. They make a deal. They'll give a witness immunity if the witness sings, even though the song might be composed to, again, use
it works for them.
It works for them. And so it's virtually unheard of for a defendant to go to trial. You have to have an extraordinary amount of backbone, principle, and I have to say money.
That's what made Hank Greenberg so unique.
Hank Greenberg is very unique. I have always admired him. It seems to me absurd what the government has tried to go after Greenberg for, but he's one of those rare individuals who didn't bite. You can win against the goons. You can win.
But if he lives long enough.
If you live long enough, you have enough money, and you have enough backbone, you actually once in a while can win. It's the one thing that kind of gives me hope that the system hasn't 100% succeeded in making us serfs.
Harvey, a group of state attorneys general in association with Al Gore have banded together to launch legal attacks on corporations, not-for-profit think tanks, and scientists who they call climate change deniers. What role do the RICO statutes play in this?
Well, first of all, this is a very upsetting area. The very word deniers, what the prosecutors and what the government officials, the kind of Goreites, if I can call them that, what they have managed to do is control the vocabulary. And everybody who disagrees with the climate change thesis becomes a denier, which means either somebody who is pathologically unwilling to face the truth or politically or economically motivated against facing the truth or agreeing with the truth, or somehow just under some kind of a spell, okay?
Well, it goes back to the Holocaust deniers, which is beyond the pale.
Yes, it is an attempt to utilize the concept of Holocaust denial, which is a very serious historical phenomenon, to utilize that in a campaign, in a political and ideological campaign, to squash and quash this other half of the climate change discourse. Now, let me just say to you, I'm not a scientist. I have friends who are scientists. I have friends on either side of this debate. More of my science friends believe in the climate change thesis, but not all of them do, and some of those who don't are extremely good scientists, very well respected by me and by others. It's a debate. And the debate hasn't been ended, and I have to tell you, should not be ended just yet. There's still plenty left to debate. Meanwhile, the whole concept of pouring carbon into the air, we have been making tremendous progress in reducing carbon because the fact is, climate change or no climate change, a lot of carbon in the air is not good.
Right.
Air pollution is not pleasant.
Well,
it's not healthy.
And while no one was looking, they discovered fracking, and all of a sudden we've switched to natural gas. But
yes.
How does any of that have to play into the RICO laws?
Well, what has happened is that prosecutors being prosecutors, drunk on their own power, they have decided now that it is a crime to deny climate change. This is not a civil debate now. This is now a crime. The prosecutors, in their wisdom, being the scientific geniuses that so many of them are, have decided there is only one legitimate side. And they have decided that the individuals, and especially the corporations, which engage in the other side, what they call denial, that the deniers can't be honestly disagreeing with the majority, so they must be involved in a nefarious conspiracy to bury the truth. Okay?
And that's where conspiracy laws come in.
Yes. And of course, conspiracy laws, which I have opposed forever, are so vague and so broad and so over-inclusive that prosecutors could actually, with a straight face, make the argument that there's a conspiracy here among corporations that have economic interests at stake to deny the climate change thesis or hypothesis. And so they're using these incredibly broad and vague laws in order to terrorize them into silence. And the latest move is they're looking to subpoena their files in order to find in those files studies and scientific reports that contradict the position taken by the corporation in the public arena.
Which they're bound to find. In any study, you're looking at both sides of an issue.
I have to tell you, if you take these prosecutors and you suddenly do a raid on their office files, guess what you will find? You will find things that contradict what they're saying today. Would you be surprised if you look at my files or your files? You'll find we've changed our mind about things. Naturally, if you're a thinking human being, you have collected information on both sides.
So these fishing expeditions are going to come up with something.
Well, of course they're going to come up with something. And the reason we have privacy laws is so that people don't have to have the government looking through their underwear drawers in order to find something that looks a little fishy. And so there's a big element of hypocrisy here, too. Now they're looking to find out if there are fraudulent acts by the corporations because the corporations are saying things that conflict with findings of scientific investigations in their files.
And there could be SEC regulation ramifications and who knows what else in that path.
And the reason there could be ramifications is because, of course, we're over-regulated. We have regulations covering everything. So the danger here is that the government is going to terrorize one side to the debate into shutting up. And what happens then? Then you no longer have a valid debate because one side has been terrorized.
The state AGs recently withdrew their subpoena against ExxonMobil and seem to be beating a retreat, yet the Democratic Party just accepted a plank in their party platform calling for the investigation of climate change deniers, and Attorney General Loretta Lynch is reportedly looking into federalizing that issue. If the Democrats win the White House in November, would you expect what some have called the climate inquisition to accelerate after the elections?
Yes, I do. I would expect that. Loretta Lynch has been a disaster as attorney. In fact, all the attorney generals under this administration have been disasters. The truth of the matter is that we have had a whole string of very bad attorneys general under both Republican and Democratic administrations.
It's been a lousy run for the last 16 years, actually.
I would say a little longer than that. The last really good attorney general I can remember was Edward Levi, who was the attorney general for 2 years under the Ford administration, after Watergate. So we've had a few attorneys general who've been terrific. Nicholas Katzenbach, I think, in the Kennedy administration. I think they say Gerald Ford's Attorney General Edward Levi of the University of Chicago. There have been a few here and there, but by and large, the attorneys general of the United States have been political hacks, and it's been a disaster.
I think many people would agree with that assessment, but one way or another, our government can only operate within certain norms supported by the people. We're raising a generation of college kids whose attitudes about free speech and the permitted diversity of political opinion have become alarmingly doctrinaire. Their lives are also being micromanaged by an exploding democracy on campus under regimes that seem to have thrown due process right out the window. What happens to America when these kids grow up to become the majority of the body politic?
Well, what happened is the current trajectory continues, only with a real vengeance. Let me comment on the bureaucratization of higher education, because I think that in the long run, it is the factor, more than any other factor, that threatens the viability of the republic. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. College campuses starting in the mid-1980s started to be beset by bureaucrats. Why? What happened in the mid-1980s is that the colleges started to open up their admissions, taking students who previously did not get into college or didn't get into the elite colleges. And suddenly, on campuses, coeducation came into vogue. There were students of different religions who were suddenly rooming in the same dorm. There were people of different races. And The student life bureaucrats, previously there might have been one dean of students on a whole
That's
campus.
what I remember.
When I went to college, there was one dean of students. There was no university police force. There were 3 suited, plainclothes officers whose only weapon were flashlights, and they were called proctors. But suddenly, all of these different kinds of students started to arrive. The student life bureaucrats feared that they would not be able to get along. They'd kill each other unless they had the intervention and guidance of, quote, professionals, okay? And so there was a sudden ramping up of the personnel in the student life bureaucracies. Suddenly you didn't have just a dean of students. You had 3 assistant deans of students.
It's an army now.
Each of them had 8 deputy assistant deans. You had deans for diversity and inclusion. That phrase makes my blood run cold, diversity and inclusion. What they were hoping for, and get this, they were hoping that they could create a student body where students looked different but thought the same.
How do you homogenize everybody?
They were looking to homogenize their minds and their attitudes. And let me tell you, they've done a damn good job of it. The student life bureaucrats have continued to burgeon in numbers, where about 5 or 6 years ago, for the first time in American history, the number of college bureaucrats outnumbered the number of teachers.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay? So now the college's purpose is not to support a faculty, but to support an army of bureaucrats, of administrators.
And they all seem to be trained in one sort of particular social justice warrior state of consciousness.
Yes, to call it training is a little misleading. It's a form of brainwashing. They go to conferences every summer, and during vacation times. And I've actually attended a couple of these conferences, and I will tell you that it's thought reform.
Language reform, for sure.
Language reform. There's a whole vocabulary that they have, and it is extraordinarily dangerous. I could tell you that I know a lot of faculty members who are made very nervous by this, but they don't have much power because the governing boards seem afraid to do anything. They're afraid they're going to get picketed. They're going to have riots.
They are getting picketed. They are having riots.
It is happening. It is happening. I should not have been surprised that this happened, but I am shocked by the extent to which the rot has set in. And let me tell you why I was surprised and what it was that I was naive about. Because up until 5 years ago, you could count, for example, on the student newspaper to oppose these stupid administrative bureaucratic edicts, okay? Would be editorials the students would demonstrate, would rebel. Starting 5 years ago, I noticed student newspaper editorials and even news reports started to veer towards support of the bureaucrats. And I said to myself, how could this have happened? And then I realized that this kind of indoctrination started for these students in kindergarten. That is to say, while people like me were focusing on academic freedom, free speech, free thought, independence on the campuses, we were not paying attention to what was happening to these kids' minds when they were 5 years old. And that indoctrination has worked its wonders. And now you get the majority of students coming up into college are pre-indoctrinated. It doesn't take that much. These freshman orientation sessions is simply confirming their beliefs rather than inculcating their beliefs.
Harvey, you paint an awful bleak picture of what we have ahead of us. Give us some hope.
Well, let me tell you why there's hope. There is still an overriding belief in this country, which many people believe, other people at least give lip service to, and that is there is a general national belief in freedom and liberty. We talk about liberty and justice for all. We still celebrate July 4th after all. And what we have to do, we being people who believe in giving new life to American liberty,
What we have to do is pivot off of that theoretical adherence and support for liberty and convince people that in order to give life to these doctrines, we have to take liberty more seriously. We have to be much more skeptical of government. We particularly have to voice opposition to the reign of the bureaucrats. You know, it's very interesting that Britain just voted to leave the European Union.
Surprised everybody.
Surprised people who didn't have their eyes open to what was going on. And I think that the best explanation for why there was this rebellion among the British people is that they resented the bureaucrats who had taken over the European Union and were issuing edict after edict after edict. By the way, many of these edicts are very anti-civil libertarian and were seriously affecting, for example, Google, which the bureaucrats wanted to control what was on the internet. So there was a rebellion in Britain. It was not bloody, but it was quite effective, and it certainly stopped a lot of people short and asked, whoa, what's this all about?
Well, Harvey, let's hope we can foment a similar rebellion here in the U.S.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll check in with you again when you finish your next book.
Thank you.
That was civil liberties attorney Harvey Silverglate, co-founder of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearfuture.com for daily updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.